Hello my lovelies and welcome back to another video. This is a standalone video on the first house of the elves, the Vanyar. But I would like to recommend to you to watch my Awakening of the Elves video first, as it explains the whole backstory and birth mythology of the elves in general. It should be linked here and in the description box. I will follow up this video with a separate one about the Noldor and the Teleri. So this is basically a three-part elves video. So anyway, here we will be talking about the first house of the elves, the Vanyar. The Vanyar, or Minyar elves as they were called, were the firstborn elves, and that is what the name Minyar actually means, firstborn. But this might be a bit misleading as not all of them were born first. How many times can you say born and first? The first elf to awoke was the elf Imin, and with him his wife Iminje. Yes, elves did awake in pairs. There were 144 OG elves that did awake, so 72 couples if my math is correct. And Imin happened to be the first one. The next was the elf Tata and his wife Tatje, and after them the elf Enel and his wife Enelje. So the three OG pairs of the elves started wandering around and discovered more and more elves that slowly did awake or were awoken by them. Each of the three, let's call them the fathers of the elves, did start to, I want to say call dibs, but that's kind of not worthy of Tolkien, although that literally is what happened. So they each added to their family or house or clan, whatever you want to call it. The original 144 were not divided evenly though. The Vanyar started off with only 14 of the original elves, the Noldor with 56 and the Teleri with 74. And this would actually foreshadow the numbers and sheer size of each elven clan for the ages to come. Even though the Vanyar are counted as the first and highest house of the elves, as their father did awake first, they were the lowest in number, even in later ages. The Teleri, the third house, was the biggest house, although they were the elves that are scattered all over Tolkien's world. They were the first ones that refused to continue the great journey west to the Undying Lands and founded the first elven kingdoms in Middle-earth. They partly made it to the Undying Lands, yes, but with great losses. Both other two houses of the elves went completely to Aman and stayed there for centuries. The Vanyar, in fact, never left the Undying Lands ever again. Well, only for a short period of time to aid the elves and the host of the good in the final fight against the great enemy Melkor or Morgoth. Let's take a closer look at the house now and the main players of the Vanyar. The Vanyar were overall spoken the most mysterious, how I personally find House of the Elves. We sadly know the least about them, so I will weave in a lot of my own thoughts about the Vanyar. Just so you're aware, a lot of what I say here is not canon. Their High King, who followed Orome's offer to see the splendor of Valinor, was Ingwë, the highest lord of all elves. The Vanyar followed their king's advice and were the first ones that actually reached Aman, the Undying Lands of the gods. They were described as the fair elves that most of all loved poetry and song, fair regarding their looks. The few Vanyar we know all had golden hair. We will get to them later. It is said that they, amongst all elves living in Aman, loved the light of the two trees the most. And yes, obviously the two trees, Laurelin and Tirion, stand for actual light. During the years of the trees, there was no sun and moon, and the blossoming of the trees ruled over the counting of time. But for me, the light of the trees always stood for enlightenment of the mind as well. Good is light and evil is darkness, to break it down to the basics. That was very often a symbolism Tolkien used in his works. The baddies, like Melkor, always try to darken the world. Yes, to actually destroy the light, but also take away the joy, the happiness, the free will, and the knowledge of people. That's what light and illumination stands for. Sauron's one ring wanted to dominate all beings and bring them to darkness. If there is light, there is good. People can read and learn and enlighten themselves. So by mentioning the Vanyar loving the light of the two trees the most, and the fact that they never wanted to leave the Undying Lands and the demigods, the Valar, that taught them everything there is to know, speaks volumes. Arriving in Aman, they first settled in Tirion or Pontuna. I know the name, I didn't invent it. It was a city built on a green hill in the valley of Kalakiria. The city walls were white and the streets glittered and shined diamond-like. And in the middle of the city there was a high tower. Actually, the name Tirion means tower in Quenya. Soon the Vanyar resettled, and the Noldor and their king Ingwë took over Tirion. The Vanyar settled fully to Taniquetil, the holy mountain and the highest peak in all the world. They settled on the flanks of the mountain. Taniquetil was the home of Mandos, the Valar, and his wife Varda, the Lady of the Stars. There were the halls of Ilmarninon, from where you could actually see the whole world. This was also the place Manwë did hold council with the great eagles, and from where he sent them to keep watch on Middle-earth. So, moving there again symbolizes the rank amongst the elder the Vanyar had. They were not only in spirit closest to the demigods of the world, but now also physically closest to them. It also means they never really again interacted with the rest of the elves or the world really. They were rare guests in Tirion and in a way were written out of the world. They went from being born on earth as elves to a form of a myth, to a kind of angels in the Undying Lands, pure, untouchable immortals, closest to the pure form and concept of the elves Eru, God, must have had in mind. They became less and less concerned with the dealings of the mortals and other beings. They dwelt in the light of the two trees, and in the grace and favor of the gods they loved and grew closer to by the day. And I guess this is one of the reasons Tolkien did give us the least information about the Vanyar. The Lord of the Rings, but also the Silmarillion, is a story about war, about temptation, about friendship, and about falling and being redeemed. And none of that were stories the Vanyar were even involved in, so why write about them? Also, I do think he wanted to keep them just as the Valar, or the concept of magic, a bit mythical, and don't give us a full account of what they had for breakfast and what their favorite song was. Also, you must know that the Silmarillion is in a way the translation of Bilbo from Elvish texts. It's the Red Book of Westmarch. The Lord of the Rings is the book that Frodo and later even Sam wrote, so it makes sense Bilbo wouldn't be overly concerned with the elves that did never really, except one time, interfere in the story itself, but prefer to stay in the Holy Lands and not care about the world going to ruins. Another thing is, if the Vanyar did rise in ranks to almost those of angels, and this is in a way a Christian or Catholic story as Tolkien in one letter even admits, it makes sense that we do not learn too much about heaven where they reside. What do Christians know about heaven? Way less than we know of temptation and original sin and the devil and the underworld. Actually, in all religions or non-religious stories, the baddies make the way better characters, and what would a great story be without someone failing and then being redeemed? And that is exactly why we know so much about the Noldor and their kingslaying, and Fëanor and his sons rebelling against the gods themselves. The Vanyar never did that. They wanted to be close to the light, to God, to wisdom. That sounds blissfully boring, and it would be if we would not have a few exceptions who stood out, and one event in particular where even the Vanyar could not refuse to take part in the dealings of the world. It was probably the greatest battle the world has ever seen and probably ever will see. Well, except Dagora, but that is another topic and another video. We are talking about the War of Wrath. What a name, if you ask me. And wrath is what, and even the Vanyar living in peace and harmony upon the holy mountain in the Holy Land did not refuse to take part in the great battles of the elves and men and dwarves and even the Valar. And I never fully understood their part in the war. We need to rewind a bit. In the early days of the Undying Lands, there were no weapons. Why would you need weapons in paradise? But then came Melkor and seed mistrust and envy amongst the elves, especially amongst the Noldor, as they, to me, were always the closest to humans with their emotions and aspirations. Melkor taught the Noldor how to forge weapons, swords, armor, and more war gear. Obviously, hoping they would one day use it against each other, and that they actually did. Well, never the Vanyar. They were said to have always mistrusted Melkor, and therefore never geared up, or not that we know of them gearing up with Melkor's help. So their portrayal, unlike the Noldor's, was never that of a warrior or even a race that had weapons nor was interested in warfare. And now comes the interesting part Tolkien gave them in the last stand, good versus evil. The Vanyar did partake in the War of Wrath and were said to have been together with the host of the demigods, the Valar, the mightiest army, and they basically did slay Morgoth's armies. Now, how do elves that only live peacefully, singing and reading and writing poetry, become the mightiest army of Middle-earth? The only explanation I can find is that they had the light of the two trees still in them and the grace of the Undying Lands. There were a few examples of elves that are described as being the most powerful elves of their times, and each time Tolkien explains it, not with some magical powers or actual strength, but with a light that shines within them, that gives them a kind of a magical, powerful strength. Galadriel had it, Medros had it, and even Glorfindel had it. All of them being born in the Undying Lands under the light of the two trees. In a way, they were not yet touched by the fading uncertainty of death of the world of Middle-earth. So yes, they must have been powerful in their wrath. Also, it is said they preferred spears and were actually good warriors. So they not just fight with the magical light that comes from within them. Lol. A last thing I want to mention that we know about their story is the Vanyar apparently were the only non-gods or angels that were mostly present in the Ring of Doom, the Mahanaxar, basically the throne room of the gods. It had the form of a circle. Parallels to the ring symbol, anyone? The other elves only were summoned there from time to time, but it looks like the Vanyar were often amongst the Valar and Maya in the throne room, which again only symbolizes their statues amongst the elves and all beings of this world. Sadly, there is not much more we can talk about, and I do not only want to speculate about them. We should mention the few Vanyar elves we know of, because that will add to the picture we already have of them. The known Vanyar elves are all except Galadriel, and if you want to count him in Glorfindel, elves that are no longer around in Middle-earth. And even Galadriel is technically not a full-blooded Vanyar. She's a quarter Vanyar, to be precise, from her paternal side. Her grandmother was Indis, from the royal house of the Vanyar. Let's maybe start with the king Ingwë. We talked about him before a bit, and again, sadly, we do not know too many details about his life. Ingwë must have been adventurous and noble and brave in his youth, otherwise he would not have been chosen to go on the journey west with the two other chosen and later kings of all elven tribes. I always saw Ingwë and the Vanyar, at least in the beginning, as the most driven and determined elves. They were smaller in numbers, but they must have been fearless. Many elves did stay behind on the journey west and never made it to the Undying Lands. Obviously, it wasn't always fear of the unknown, but imagine this. A to you unknown demigod offers you to come and join him on a long and dangerous journey, leave everything you know and your people behind, explore a foreign world filled with gods and wonders, and then go back, convince your people to accompany you and do it all over again. Quite the accomplishment, if you ask me. And yes, it must have been due to his advice that the Vanyar kind of erased themselves from all worldly matters and beings over time and kind of rose to the heavens. But when it really mattered, he was there and probably allowed or commanded to help his people to aid the host of the good in the War of Wrath. Also notable, his high kingship in Valinor seems to have been unchallenged, and besides the Noldor, who were not his people, rebelling against the gods, we do not know of any uprising of elves against him during his kingship. So I guess he must have been a good and wise king. Tolkien would have definitely told us if it weren't the case. Ingwë himself stayed behind in Valinor during the War of Wrath, but he sent his son Ingwë to lead the armies. Another interesting fact was the friendship amongst all elven kings at that time, Elwë, Finwë and Ingwë, the three former ambassadors of the elves that later became their kings. After the death of his first wife, Míriel, the king of the Noldor, Finwë, was looking for another wife because he wanted to have more children. And it seems like Ingwë did indeed set his either daughter or sister or niece. We have different accounts for this. I would personally go with daughter or niece, as we do not know Ingwë had parents, because he wouldn't if he was amongst the first ones that did awake, and therefore I do not think he would have had a sister. Also, we know of his son, so it would make sense he wanted to find a suitor for his daughter. And who better than another king, the king of the Noldor? So he did invite Finwë to come and live with him for a while, and the plan took off, and he actually did fall in love with Indis the Fair. Let me quote Tolkien. Indis had loved Finwë in her heart, ever since the day when the Vanyar and the Noldor lived close together. In one of his wanderings, Finwë met her again upon the inner slopes of Olose, and her face was lit by the golden light of Laurelin that was shining in the plain of Esellohar below. In that hour, Finwë perceived in her eyes the love that had before been hidden from him. So it came to pass that Finwë and Indis desired to be wedded. Quote end. Let's talk about Indis a bit, because she in fact has a very important role in this legendarium. I do not want to go too deep into her story, but as the new wife and queen of the Noldor, she did not only become the stepmother to Feanor, the greatest elf that ever was, but also gave the king two more sons, and they would later become the main characters of the whole Silmarillion, and the forefathers of many characters and main players of all ages to follow, Fingolfin and Finarfin. She also bore him two daughters, Findis and Irime. Short side note here, I personally think Glorfindel was either Findis or rather Irime's son. He was said to be a prince of all elves, and he had blonde and fair hair and the looks of the Vanyar. Yes, he's counted amongst the Noldor, and he is said to be kin to Turgon, the king of Gondolin. But Turgon was a descendant of Indis the Vanyar, so I'm pretty sure she was his grandmother, just as she was Galadriel's grandmother. Back to Indis. She was known to be a great beauty, obviously, as any elf, but Tolkien mentions it specifically for a few of his elven characters. After, spoiler alert, the death of her husband by the hands of Melkor and the shunning and exile of her stepson Feanor, Indis and her eldest daughter Findis returned to her people and lived near Taniquetil, the holy mountain. And just to prove how important Indis was to the story and how many of the great elves and later kings and lords were descendants of Indis, let me name a few of them. The mentioned Turgon was her grandson, just as Fingon and the White Lady of the Noldor, Aredel. Also, Finrod, the king of Nargothrond, and his sister Galadriel are counted amongst her grandchildren. She also was the great-great-great-grandmother of the first Númenórean king Elros, and with that, his twin, the well-known Lord of Rivendell, Elrond, just to name a few actually. Another Vanyar elf was at least known, we know a little of, was the wife of the king of Gondolin, Turgon's wife Elenwë. Like all Vanyar, she had golden hair and did pass that on to some of her descendants. She bore Turgon one daughter, Idril Celebrindal, who would have a major role in the later legendarium. She did follow her husband, who was a Noldorian prince, on the journey of the Noldor to Middle-earth. After her husband's uncle Feanor did burn the ships of the Teleri that should have taken them to Middle-earth, the leader of the trapped Noldor, Fingolfin, as well as her husband, did lead their people on the dangerous journey across the Helcaraxe, an icy wasteland and only land part connecting the continent of Aman to Middle-earth at that time. Elenwë was the only full-blooded Vanyar elf that did take part in the flight of the Noldor, and that rebelled against the gods. Although, again, she and her husband and most of the descendants of Feanor's stepbrothers had other motives than rebellion in mind when they left for the vast birthland of their ancestors. Sadly, Elenwë was amongst those who did not make it alive to Middle-earth. She fell into the icy waters with her daughter Idril, and her husband could only save her daughter. So she was also counted amongst the victims of Feanor's oath in a way, and understandably from then on her husband and later king of Gondolin had nothing but hate in his heart for Feanor. Amongst her descendants are also some of the most important elves of the later ages. Her daughter Idril was the mother of Earendil the Mariner. Through the children of that marriage, the concept of half-elves was created, and they later got the choice to either choose immortality or mortality. Earendil was the father of Elrond and Elros, and yes, the lines with the former mentioned line of Indis, the other Vanyar in the royal house of the Noldor crossed paths and created basically Aragorn's and Arwen's ancestors. And I hope I didn't confuse you too much, and I want to end this video here, as sadly I really couldn't find much more information about the Vanyar. But I think this gives us a pretty good overview. I think it is clear that they are the highest ranks of elves, not just in name. Many things did prove that. They were the first ones to awaken. They were the ones that did made it to Valinor. Descendants of that line like Earendil did fight and win against Morgoth, and they were the closest to the gods, in spirit but also physically. Thank you, my lovelies. I hope you enjoyed this video. The following one will be similar to this one, talking obviously about the second house, the Noldor. Bye bye.